How's that song?
Mike's Daily Podcast.
I still wanted to do a podcast yesterday, and then stuff.
Mike's Daily Podcast.
Then stuff happened, and I enjoyed the fact that my couch felt really nice and comfortable underneath my body, and the spiced latte that I had was delicious. And I don't mean to be so vicious to myself, but I enjoyed relaxing on my couch, watching Shakespeare and Hathaway.
Mike's Daily Podcast.
They're two detectives. One's last name is Shakespeare. The other's last name is Hathaway. Hey, that was actually William Shakespeare's wife.
Mike's
Hathaway.
Daily
Wasn't her name Anne Hathaway?
Podcast.
Like that actress that's really...
Yeah!
Anne Hathaway upstaged the original Anne Hathaway. Is that what happened? The one with her all her movies and her... What is Shakespeare's wife was Anne, but they spelled it... No, they're exactly the same. What? Huh. She was the wife of William Shakespeare, the English poet, playwright, and actor. They were married in 1582 when Hathaway was 26 years old and Shakespeare was 18. She outlived her husband by 7 years. Very little is known about her life beyond a few references in legal documents. Her personality and relationship to Shakespeare have been the subject of much speculation by many historians and writers. But of course, she has been eclipsed by the gal that's been in many movies. And, oh yeah, Brokeback Mountain. I'm instantly thinking of Get Smart. She was in that. She played 99 in that. But Anne Hathaway. So I had a friend who was in a play that was written by someone she knew. And the play was called Anne Hathaway. And it was about the premise.
And here's today's podcast picture.
What if Shakespeare's wife wrote all of the plays and Shakespeare just sort of took credit for it? And that's when I first heard the term Anne Hathaway. This was years before Anne Hathaway ever got popular with all those Princess Diaries things that she did. So there you go. Fascinating. Isn't that fascinating? So the podcast picture today is not of Basil the Boxer. He was in the last one. You can see that at MikesDailyPodcast.com. This is episode 2354 today. Whoops, nope, 2344. 2344. That's right. You can see a picture of the late, great Basil the Boxer, Fairmont Ridge. That was the last podcast picture. Today's podcast picture is of a new friend that we have that we've been taking care of for about 6 months or so. We rescued him when he was depleted and no one had taken ownership of him, and he was walking the hills of Podcastro Valley, living on sheer wits, surviving on his wits is what he was doing. I'm talking about the cat named Rodler. Rodler the cat. Now Rodler the cat is happy and content. And we have another cat that we've saved too that was walking the hills. These cats were never chipped before. They had no chip in their body. They probably had never been petted before. Now they get pets regularly. They get pets and scratches and they're so happy, and they get fed and they're defleed and dewormed and they're happy as can be. And this is something it makes me proud. But this is Rodler the cat. The other cat was Patches, and we have pictures of Patches at MikesDailyPodcast.com. But you can see the picture of Rodler at MikesDailyPodcast.com with a little iron. I think it's made out of iron. It's a cat, a little cat sculpture. It's basically a doorstop is what it is. But it came with the house. When I purchased my house in 2009, this came with the house and I kept it. There were a couple other things that came with the house. A broom. A very old Frigidaire. Is it a Frigidaire? It's one of those old refrigerators. It doesn't work anymore, but I kept it. A couple other things. I'm a bit of a keeper. I keep things, a lot of things. So perhaps we should discuss that. But instead, and MikesDailyPodcast.com is where you can also go to not only see the podcast picture today, but to hear me on the radio tomorrow. I'm doing my radio show tomorrow and every Sunday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Pacific time. And you can see the link. You can click on the link and listen to me live between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. tomorrow. And the link is at MikesDailyPodcast.com. Lincoln. Oh, gosh. I watched a documentary about Lincoln, about the murder of Abraham Lincoln by Booth. And I had no idea about what ensued. You know, he wasn't caught for like 12 days. I didn't realize that. It's a fascinating documentary. Found it on the History Channel. It's actually kind of dated now, but fascinating how Booth and his sidekick, I don't know, I forget the guy's name, they basically walked around hiding in the woods, hiding in the swamp, trying to outmaneuver the police, the soldiers trying to find him. Because so he thought when he murdered Lincoln that he would become this celebrity and everybody would be, oh, thank you, Booth. Instead, everybody hated him. In fact, people were getting murdered. People were getting executed. They were getting hung by people who thought that if they looked anything like Booth, so people are judging the picture from what they saw in the newspaper. If you look like Booth, you could have been strung up and hanged up and killed. This was a lot of hangings going on at this time. So he didn't realize somebody smuggled him a newspaper out in the swamp, out in the woods, and he read it and he went, what? They hate me? No, I was going to be hailed as a hero, and now I see everybody hate. As soon as that clicked in his head, stuff started to change. And at one point, he ran into some people that were going to help him. And they were asking, what was it like? What was it like to, and he goes, oh, it's nothing to brag about. Whereas before he was, he was all full of himself. That's why he did it. Anyway, there's a bunch of other stuff. I'm not a historian. I just watched it on the History Channel, but it's a fascinating story. The guy, Dr. Mudd, because Booth basically fell from the balcony to the stage after he killed Lincoln, and he hurt his leg. As we go outside a cafe anyway, we're bringing Mike's Daily Podcast somewhere in Podcastro Valley, the last place on earth. He hurt his leg. This Dr. Mudd reset his leg for him. So he's walking around now with a reset leg. He's still in a lot of pain, but he's hiding out in the woods there, Virginia, and all that. And Mudd later gets caught. He gets thrown in jail. He is at some jail somewhere where I think the yellow fever, was it called yellow fever, scarlet fever? One of the fevers breaks out. And this Dr. Mudd saves everybody at this prison. And because of that, he got pardoned later. But that term, your name is Mudd, I believe that came from that. Although I don't think that documentary confirmed that, but I had heard that before. At any rate, fascinating story. Look into it. The guy that was assisting Lincoln the whole time, Lincoln he gets cornered in an old barn, and they tell him, come out. And the guy who had been assisting Lincoln says, I'm out of here. And Booth almost shoots him, but then he says, okay, go. And then he shouts out to the police, don't worry, this guy didn't do it. I've been holding him against his will. He has nothing to do with it. And then he still wouldn't leave the barn. The soldiers set the barn on fire. Lincoln looked like he was going to shoot a gun. One of the soldiers saw that through the planks of the barn and was going to shoot him in the shoulder so that he would drop the gun. Instead, he shot him in the neck. And Booth was paralyzed and slowly dying. And you probably heard this part. The last words that Booth said, he was looking at his hands, and he said something like, useless, useless. And then he died. Yes. That was his, wow. pretty dramatic. That wasn't in that movie, Lincoln, that Spielberg did a few years back. They didn't go into all that. It was mostly about the end of the Civil War, but wow. And so, yeah, the Civil War had just ended. And they talk about in this documentary how parts of the South, even though they had lost, they still were okay with Lincoln. They were quite upset when Lincoln was assassinated, whereas Booth thought everyone was going to cheer for him as a hero because he killed Lincoln. And then they executed 4 people who had helped Booth. And it was a mass hanging of 4 people. And that apparently was one of the first times that a special type of film was used, because this is in 1864, 63, somewhere in that area. And so the film technology, taking pictures, wasn't that, nothing like we have it today. We all walk around with cameras on ourselves everywhere we go. But they were able to get really good pictures of this mass execution. That's all on the History Channel. That, and I watched a thing about Pepsi and Coke fighting it out over the years. That's actually on YouTube if you want to watch that. That's on a CNN report about the history of the fight between Coke and Pepsi and the Pepsi Challenge and how big that was. And that was one of the first times in our culture where 2 mass companies went head-to-head against each other. And Coke, for the longest time, never even acknowledged Pepsi. And then they finally hired Bill Cosby to do commercials, to be the spokesperson for Coke, because he was all wholesome back then. And Bill Cosby's like, what's Pepsi doing with all of this? These challenges. Look, they're lying. Let's actually watch a taste test right now. See, people do pick Coke more often than Pepsi. And then he talked about how Pepsi broke a lot of ground with that Pepsi Challenge, and then also with hiring Michael Jackson. That was a huge coup. That was like one of the first times a celebrity was used to endorse a big product like that, a pop celebrity. And about how they got David Bowie and Tina Turner to do a song. They retooled Modern Love to be about Pepsi. And how Coke tried to fight back by having Diet Coke and then trying to come out with new Coke, which of course was a horrible thing. But then when they came out with Coca-Cola Classic, they apparently did really well with that. People forget about that was actually a good move on Coke's part to redeem themselves. It's one of the only times that a company was able to turn it around after making a mass mistake. So all of that is what yours truly, Mike Matthews, has been doing. In the absence of all of the podcasts, he has not been doing these podcasts lately, and that's what I've been up to, absorbing all of that for you. And that's what this podcast is about. Hey, this is also what I wanted to tell you. As I said, hey, don't come around here no more, and did a little Tom Petty. Sometimes it is impossible to do our workouts during the holiday season. And we're like, oh, all the stuff going on at work. And then there's all the festivities and all the food that can be available. If you find yourself in this situation, you should consider incorporating a good walking program into your days. The U.S. Surgeon General recently recommended that we walk at least 10,000 steps each day for good health. Now, I do about 5,000, and I'm not in the best shape at this point. I could be a lot better, but 10,000 steps requires a lot of extra time that I don't seem to have these days. I can't even do a podcast every single day because I get interrupted. So 5,000 is the best I can do. But 10,000 steps each day is what the U.S. Surgeon General recommends. It gives us a target to try and reach each day. So you should get yourself some comfortable walking shoes. You can get a pedometer pretty easily. There are free apps now for your smartphone. This article from eZine Articles, eZineArticles.com. And the tips they give is work walking into your shopping trips. Make it a practice to park as far away from the entrance to the shopping mall as possible. This will help in two ways. First, you'll always find more parking spaces on the outskirts of the shopping mall. The second benefit of parking on the outskirts of the mall is that you have automatically increased the number of walking steps into your shopping trip. I like that. Yes, I've mentioned that before on this podcast, tricking yourself into working out. At the end of the day, you can look at your pedometer and see how you did for that day. If you have not hit the target amount of steps, take a stroll around the neighborhood or take a little time to do a short workout. By knowing how many steps you need to take to hit your target, you know how long that you need to exercise. The holiday season is great, but do not let it completely stop your exercise program. Get creative. Do extra things to get your target number of steps completed each day. Walking is the perfect answer to not being able to exercise during the holiday season. They also mention WileyWeightLoss.com. And that's what I wanted to share with you about that. So, dinner outside a cafe anyway, somewhere in Podcastro Valley. And yours truly is a keeper. Podcastro Valley 10. Twitter has reportedly suspended a number of accounts by mistake after far-right extremists began exploiting the platform's new private media policy. The platform has since launched an internal review of the matter and has made the necessary corrections. The new policy, which allows individuals to request takedowns of photos or videos that contain them, has become the target of far-right activists who seek to remove pictures of them taken at hate rallies. The platform originally said that the rule was put in place to curb the misuse of media to harass, intimate, and reveal the identities of private individuals, which Twitter says disproportionately affects women, activists, dissidents, and members of minority communities. Extremists began abusing Twitter's new system shortly after it debuted. Far-right activists reportedly used services like Telegram and Gab to organize against anti-extremist accounts that work to expose and keep track of white supremacists and hate rallies. They sought to get these accounts suspended and have their personal photos removed. And then there is Taylor Swift, who has a song called All Too Well. It is the longest song to take the top spot of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It has broken the record. And she sent flowers to Don McLean, whose song American Pie first set that record when it hit number one in 1972. Its runtime was 8 minutes and 37 seconds. The new version of All Too Well, a part of Swift's re-release of her 2012 album Red, clocks in at just over 10 minutes. Don McLean said, "What a class act." I don't know. I don't think, look, okay, so Freebird is over 10 minutes, as I recall. And then there's some songs by Yes and the prog rock bands of the 70s. There were some dance mixes that were pretty long. Come On Baby Light My Fire by The Doors was a much longer song, and then it got edited for the radio. And artists in general, musicians in general, agree that, they don't like to edit their songs down. It's like editing, would you take a paint stroke out of a Picasso, or would you edit a book that would, well, you know what? I would. Some movies that are considered classics, I watch and I go, they could have taken that whole scene out. Listening to my podcast, I go, I could have maybe have chopped that whole section out, but instead I kept it in. And perhaps maybe Taylor Swift years from now will look back at that song and go, I could have taken out that whole verse or that whole repeating section that went nowhere. But at any rate, it has gotten popular. it's apparently hit the number one. Wait, has it? Let's see here. The record isn't the only one Swift has broken following the release of Red's Taylor's version with the album. She also set the record for most simultaneous U.S. Hot 100 entries by a woman, with 26 songs from the album making the Hot 100 chart. The record was previously 18 songs, which she set in 2019 with the album Lover. It says here, Don McLean said, American Pie remained on the top for 50 years, and now Taylor Swift has unseated such a historic piece of artistry. Let's face it, nobody ever wants to lose that number one spot. But if I had to lose it to somebody, I'm sure glad it was another great singer-songwriter such as Taylor. Wait, what I don't understand is this song number one? Or did it just get on the chart? It says here, oh, it is at the top spot of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Okay. I'm going to be honest, I have not heard it on the radio. I don't know of any radio station that would take out 10 minutes of their time to play that song. If they did, they would do it at night. Just saying. Which, by the way, speaking of radio, I saw the guy who gave me my first on-air job. He gave me, well, he first hired me to do research, and that was a whole interesting thing to listen to watch him in this interview, because that was his whole claim to fame, was he did research. In the 80s, if you wanted to make waves, make money, you would get a job at a radio station saying, well, you know what? I do research and I find out what gets good ratings. And then if you did the research and you did get good ratings, then everybody hailed you as some genius and you could make a bunch of money in radio back in the day. And this guy did that. In fact, I was employed to do research, which entailed this. You would call somebody up. The phone that we used would have a cassette wired in. I don't know how they did that. Not technically minded that way. But the engineer set that up so we'd have a cassette player hooked into the phone line. And we'd call these random phone numbers and get these people. This is back in the mid-'80s. If we'd ask them if they'd want to do this test, then they'd say yes or no. If they said yes, we'd play them, I think, 10, maybe 20 songs. But they were like little bits of the song, the chorus. And ask them what did they think of the song. Did they like it? Did they not like it? Now, I don't know if he used this research. I remember one guy, and you get into interesting conversations with these callers that you would call, and they would tell you things like, yeah, I don't like any of this pop stuff. And this is in the 80s. I only like rock. I only like the classic rock. And, you know, I see some of that doing the research and getting that information. And, you know, you know more than if you had your head in the sand. You know a lot more than that. So I can see where that would be helpful. But this guy did a lot of that, and he did this interview, and he hasn't changed much at all. His hair, his look is exactly the same. He sounds the same. Watching him talk, I was immediately transported back to the 80s when I worked for him. But I was like, well, you know, I only really worked for him for about a year. And I think that's probably all I could have done, because after listening to him for about 5 minutes, I was, yeah, he was a bit, that side of radio I'm not a big fan of. But at any rate, 10-minute song. Don't know if that is a thing that works for all radio stations to play 10-minute songs. But there you go. Apparently it is number one. And apparently we're outside a cafe anyway, somewhere in Podcaster Valley. And apparently you're an awesome listener because you've gone through a lot of this interesting discussion on today's podcast about music and walking and Shakespeare's wife. Look who's here. Hello, my commercial to Madame Rootabega, and this was a very interesting discussion. Oh! Do you think that you and Shakespeare would have been a good couple?
Yes.
Do you think that you and Taylor Swift could have done a song longer than 10 minutes?
Yes.
Do you think this podcast should be over?
No.
Oh, good. Because we got 2 more people to talk to. Hello.
Hello there, Mike. This is Valentino, the parking attendant.
And this is Bison Bentley. Do you know that?
Mike, we was hearing about you talking about Taylor Swift, and we want to hear more about Taylor Swift. Tell us everything, dear Mike. Dear.
Yeah, Taylor Swift. Do you know that? Well, she's got lots of money because she sells a lot of records. Oh, and the whole story about that re-releasing that album, her 2012 album Red, the re-release is part of her effort to regain ownership of her early catalog after record executive and music manager Scooter Braun gained control of her first 6 albums' master recordings in 2019 via an acquisition deal. And that, I think, breaks all kinds of records. That's never been done before, so good for her. And that's the end of the podcast. Next show, it will be the wonderful Chely Shoehart, Floyd the Floorman, John Deere the engineer. You can chime in about anything we covered today at 336MM Daily. 3 + 3 = 6. MM as in Mike Matthews Daily, as in what this podcast will try to be. But of course gets interrupted because that's life. And, you know, just if you can't podcast every day, you should at least try to walk every day, is our slogan. That's what we say. And then A-Frame says this.
Mike's Daily Podcast is written and produced and performed by Mike Matthews. His podcast is super easy to find. Download or listen to his show and read his blog at MikesDailyPodcast.com. Email Mike now at MikesDailyPodcast@gmail.com. See you tomorrow. Bye.